Welcome back to Reimagine 2020. I'm Yonah Hochhauser, and today I'm joined by Gustav Arentoft, BizDev rep for Europe and Africa for the Maker Foundation. Gustav, thanks for joining us.
Thanks very much for having me. It's a pleasure.
All right. Now, Gustav, before we actually started this, we were talking about how you were crazy busy because DeFi is just exploding right now. What do you think is led to this massive, what started the hype train for DeFi?
Yeah, so I mean, I think especially since we saw Compound come out with their comp distribution scheme in June, we have definitely seen like insane amounts of liquidity coming into DeFi. But I think it started already going pre that, right? I think that like there's been built so much infrastructure. We see so many of the infrastructure projects, like Maker, like Uniswap, Balancer, and like all of these Curve, for example, all of these automated market making pools. So like, it's been really, really easy for like a lot of projects to go in and attract a lot of liquidity and, attract users basically starting from like day one. So, this has also meant that we have seen an incredible demand for DAI, and we've seen so many assets coming into DeFi. In June, we were around $1 billion, which was like a big milestone when we hit it back then, right? I think we hit it in around May. But since then, we have really seen, this number multiply, right? So we just in the last couple of days hit around $6 billion in assets in DeFi. So,
Wow.
that in combination with, of course, the crypto market being quite positive overall. So, there's just inherently been like some growth in the value of assets already being in the protocols, but then it's also managed to attract a lot of new users and a lot of new assets. So I think, just like a combination of like a lot of these things, finally, being finished, things are lining up, the infrastructure being built out, and then some like new, protocols being built on top of that has really been like a strong way to attract users and capital.
Do you feel that, the groundwork has already been laid? Like you mentioned, this has been a long time coming, and all the gains, all this massive liquidity that's been pumped in is going to stay and it's going to be grown upon? Or do you think, there is that baseline, but a lot of the money in now is just hype, and we're gonna fall back a little bit, and it's gonna take some time to actually build a sustainable growth?
I mean, I think that, like for a lot of the protocols, running now, I don't really like, for example, like the two biggest protocols right now is, Maker and Aave in terms of, assets in the protocol, and neither Maker or Aave is doing any like crazy things to attract liquidity. They're just, Aave, they have been, building out a lot of products really, really fast, and has really managed to attract, a large user base because of kind of like this approach, right? And at Maker, we've been the market leaders in DeFi for a while now, but I would say that like in a lot of these protocols, liquidity will be sticky in the sense that, it will stick around in the ecosystem. Who will have what on a given day might depend on what the conditions in the general market and the general sentiment looks like. But I mean, unless we see, things, go down a lot again, like we would have like a negative outcome in the prices of these assets inside the protocol. So I think it would be fair to assume that, the trend will continue and more and more liquidity will be added into it.
Well, let's dive into Maker a little bit. I understand, it's decentralized finance, and I understand that, pegging the DAI to the US dollar is done to minimize volatility. But, does this affect the decentralization aspect, of crypto versus fiat? I understand on one hand you need it, but is the goal eventually to kind of disconnect it from the dollar?
I mean, actually in the original Maker white paper, a peg to like a, non-dollar currency was actually initially described, where you would, instead of pegging DAI to, an existing fiat currency, you would peg it to kind of like a basket or like a group of not only currencies, but also commodities, and kind of like try to make a derivative of, something that would be like less inflationary, would it be less prone to like getting hit by inflation, would be like more stable to like the world economy rather than an individual fiat. Maker is really able to pick DAI to anything, right? So I mean, if something crazy were to happen with the dollar, it wouldn't be, completely out of the question to think that like the Maker governance community would want to peg it to something else. But right now it's really in the hands of the governance community, and there's also been described plans of having a DAI pegged to other fiat currencies, such as, for example, the euro, which for me working with the European market would be incredible to have, right? So like it really depends on like where the scope will head in the next like 6 to 12 months for the community, right? But right now with the kind of like activity and like pressure we see in the markets currently, it's very difficult for us to kind of like pinpoint or give like an idea of like where we even ourselves would think it would go, right?
Well, that's kind of the beauty of Maker and other DAOs and decentralized financial instruments, where the governance is decentralized and kind of the community can react to what they're seeing, what makes sense at the time. It truly is market dynamics without the outside input. And speaking on that, is the team at Maker looking at different ways to increase governance participation?
Yeah, I mean, from the foundation side, we're always trying to figure out, ways that we can get like more participants, right? I think one of the things that has been looked at quite a lot is vote delegation, right? I also know that we already have a few, people on Twitter who, proclaim themselves to be Maker politicians. So, you could imagine that, later on you would be able to delegate your MKR, because like it is a very time-consuming process to keep yourself up to date with everything that's going on in the protocol, right? And like from like surveys and stuff, this is something that we have kind of like an idea that this is one of the things that would like keep people from voting, right? So if you look at like voter apathy in like as a whole, right? There's like in like lack of enlightenment or like lack of knowledge of what is going on. Like you don't want to go in and start voting on things that you don't fully understand, right? So like if you don't have the time to basically participate in the entire governance cycle, you might rather want to delegate, your votes to someone else. And then there's another thing, which is, just like, feeling that you are, lacking, voting power, right? So like if you only have like 1 or 5 or 10 MKR, or like maybe like 100 or 200, right? I mean, we actually had a vote recently that like, was, the difference was 50 MKR. So,
Wow.
in that vote, for example, you would actually have made the difference, right? But if you look at like generally how much is getting voted in there, right? I mean, if you're holding just 50 MKR, it would be, rarely that you would think that you would be the one who would make the difference, right? But like if you could just delegate it to someone else, right? And they could kind of like, go in and like vote on behalf of what you wanted to see happen, right? Then that might be something that, you would be much more prone to do. And also just I think in regards to like if you look at like for example like political governance, right? Where we have these like periods of like voting for politicians, right? And that's basically like a kind of like the old world's form of delegation, right? So you can imagine if you had a delegation system on the blockchain, right? I mean, I would be able to go in and verify everything that this guy or girl that I would delegate my votes to. I could go in and verify everything they vote for, and if they vote for something I don't like, I could remove my delegation immediately and send it to someone else, where it wouldn't be like I would be locked in for like a period of time. So in that sense, you also have kind of like these checks and balances that like if someone starts acting completely out of like what he promised the community he would act like, then you might very quickly see the votes getting pulled from him.
Mm-hmm. Well, that seems like such a wonderful solution to historically what's been a big fault with the political representation system. Do you think, and do you see a future? I mean, for so long, DeFi has been trying to kind of emerge from the shadows, and right now it's getting its chance in the spotlight, showing what decentralized financial tools could do compared to traditional financial tools. Do you think that this is also an opportunity for DAOs, for kind of these decentralized organizations to prove its worth in governance as well? As in, if this works, if DeFi and Maker and this succeeds, do you feel that there will be a future where actual real political governance could be done through this, like you said, on the blockchain, instantaneous, taking away votes, putting it for a new person, so really empowering the people more?
I mean, to be honest, I don't really think that, I mean, I think it would be like an utopia, right? It would be something that would, be like incredible for like the individuals, but I think it doesn't look like something that I believe would be able to happen, in any time soon outside of like a science fiction novel, right? And also, I think if we look at just like, how these like DAO based governance things happen in general, right? I mean, it's incredibly inefficient, right? So of course, like if you could have like a purely delegation system like that would be able to speed up the decisions, right? But I don't think that something like that necessarily would be, if you had something that was only based on delegation, right? I don't think that would necessarily be better than what we see now in the political systems, right? But I mean, I think, yeah, I don't think it's something that we should aim to achieve anytime soon. I think right now we should focus on getting DeFi into the hands of people outside of the Ethereum space as well.
For sure, and I doubt the governments would give up their powers to this in order to let it happen. You spoke a little.
Yeah.
You mentioned right there about a little bit of the DAO's inefficiencies in government. What are some of those inefficiencies, and how does it affect the DeFi space?
I mean, it's. I mean, I think it's quite simple, right? I mean, if you have like you always have this like scale of like a completely centralized company or like corporation to like the completely decentralized one, right? And you could see, for example, and I think it's the same just in general, right? But centralized authorities, it's like centralized decision makers, right? You're able to take very quick decisions in that matter, right? So if you have like a business or like a company that's running a completely top-down approach, right? Like you're very, very quick at making decisions, even changing decisions, or like just in general, like adapting to things that are currently happening around you. One of the drawbacks is that if it's a single person taking these decisions, you cannot quite always be confident that they take them in the best or the most correct way, right? Where if you go on the scale like complete decentralization, if you need to mobilize like 10,000 people into a decision-making process rather than having one person taking the decision, that just takes like an awful amount of time, right? So it's kind of like this trade-off of like being more inefficient, but at the same time securing the process of taking that decision, right? And in that sense, you can kind of like secure the decision that would come out of it. So like that's why I think like applying decentralization to anything. I mean, this is something I've also spoken on in the past, that like I don't think that it necessarily makes sense to make everything decentralized, right? And like in those processes where you should do it is where you really want to keep like the decision-making process as something that is like very important, right? So for example, in a project like Maker, we are really an infrastructure project, right? We're providing DAI, which is kind of like the infrastructure of DeFi, right? The stable infrastructure that gets added to a lot of these DeFi protocols, and that's why we need to have like when so many projects and applications and users and people depend on DAI, we need to make sure that we have like a very, very strong decision-making process around DAI, so that no one could go in and kind of like mess with it. Because if someone were able to mess with DAI, then we would have so many users that would be affected, right, of the system, right? Not only are the other DeFi protocols, but also the end users who's we have a pretty big community in Argentina, for example, like people who doesn't necessarily care about crypto, but who just want to be able to stay out of the local fiat in that local environment where they live in, right? Escape the local inflation. So in that sense, I don't think it makes sense to apply like decentralization or decentralized governance to anything, but I do believe that in these infrastructure projects where you have a lot of other protocols, apps, dApps, and users relying on them, it definitely makes a lot more sense.
Mm-hmm. Well, what has been in your view the most controversial governance decision or that has happened so far in Maker?
So I mean, I think probably the first time we added a centralized asset to the protocol, that was something that definitely sparked a lot of comments and talk on Twitter, right? Because I think even though that it was announced and like described in the initial white paper, which was written all the way back in around 2015, launching multi-collateral DAI and looking into the possibilities of having real world assets. Of course, if the community would want that as part of the system, the whole topic about like real world assets in the protocol, centralized assets, assets that actually has a centralized counterparty, potentially in this opens up for the risk of like a central point of failure for that specific asset type. And that's definitely something that with Maker historically only being backed by Ethereum, which is a trustless, immutable crypto asset, right? Then all of a sudden going to the direction of having something that actually has a centralized counterparty risk. That's definitely, you know, a very controversial topic, I think, and still is.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned that DAI underpins so much of DeFi right now. What is the coolest use for DAI that you've seen in the wild that you just never thought would happen?
I mean, like, to be honest, I think like a lot of the stuff that we have seen over the summer here has really, you know, proved, you know, kind of like the composability of these protocols and projects, that like when you start, you know, adding them up, then you can really accelerate innovation in a way that we have never seen before. It was kind of like something that like I theorized about it happening, right, eventually, you know, but you know, I think the way that we have seen it happening over like the last couple of months, you know, with, for example, Yonah Finance, as well as, you know, like Curve, it's also been doing like an amazing job recently. You know, I think, you know, seeing how these protocols use, you know, DAI, for example, to attract liquidity by, you know, having some kind of like native token distribution on top of it, right? It really was, you know, pivoted from Comp's distribution scheme, right? I think that's something that like I didn't really imagine it happening this way, but I think it's been very, very interesting to follow.
Mm-hmm. Do you think there's any possibility of kind of changing the MKR tokenomics to capture some of the fees generated instead of only burning them?
I mean, whether it's like theoretically possible, yeah.
Well, I mean, anything's theoretically possible, but do you foresee any reason, whether it be to even increase governance participation or for any other reason?
I mean, there has been discussions about, you know, if the MKR token could be used in another way. But I think right now with everything that's going on, I think like the main focus is on, you know, how do we get even more DAI out there? You know, how do we get as many collateral types in the protocol as possible? So I think it's really something that, you know, yeah, I think it's possible, and I think it's something that like the community will revisit later on. You know, the same way that, for example, the community has been looking at like, you know, redoing the auction model and like, you know, redoing, you know, several things inside the system, right? So I think it's definitely something that will be like visited later on. What the model will look like, I'm not quite sure, because there's of course like a lot of considerations that has to go into it, right?
Mm-hmm. I guess that's the beauty of DeFi. It goes where it takes it. It goes. You don't really have control.
Yeah, and then also, you know, with the innovation that we've seen recently, right? I mean, we don't know what's going to come out in like 6 months or like in 12 months, right? So, you know, there might come something out that like, again, completely shifts the landscape of what we thought was the way that we used these assets before, right? So, you know, I think, yeah, over like, I don't know, I'm very excited for the next like 12 to 18 months.
Mm-hmm. What do you see as the main advantage of MakerDAO versus Compound or Aave or any other one?
I mean, you know, I think, you know, it's symbiosis, right? So like we live and thrive by the possibilities that we create for one another, right? So like already back when Compound launched, like very, very long ago, right? Now it feels like forever ago, right? Back then, you know, they launched and they all of a sudden became, you know, like the main kind of like arbitrage opportunity that would be between, you know, the Maker protocol and another project, which then, you know, created applications like InstaDApp, for example, right? Mm-hmm. So, you know, InstaDApp, they built this protocol where you would, you know, is it cheaper to lend, to borrow at Maker, or is it cheaper to borrow at Compound? And you could like, you know, change your position with like one click button, right? So already back then, you know, we saw that like Compound very quickly attracted a very large portion of DAI, right? And I think today still, you know, we have, I don't know, I think like a couple of 100 million DAI in Compound, right? So like, I think like the way that we really should see this is not so much that we're like competitors in that sense. You know, I think, for example, that like Aave and Compound might see each other more as like competition, right? But like for us at Maker, you know, we really provide infrastructure to all of these other protocols, right? Which comes in the form of DAI and the DSR. So in that sense, you know, I don't really think that, I think like it's difficult for us to, because there's not really any other like significant decentralized stablecoin projects out there, right? So, you know, there's some that's been like trying, and like some have like, you know, for example, like synthetic USD as well from Synthetics, but it's not really something that is like intended to be used the same way that DAI is being used. And right now, frankly, we have around 800 live DAI integrations with different projects and protocols, just from like what the team itself has been, or like what the foundation itself has been in contact with. So like potentially we would have over 1,000 partners, right? All using DAI in different shapes and forms. So I think that's probably one of the big advantages that the Maker protocol has right now, is that we have been so like from the get-go, we really knew that like the way to get this really to become this unstoppable force, right? We needed a very focused and sharp business team that really could go in and ensure that we had a massive business development growth, and that's really what I've been working on for the past 2 years, right? So of course, there's like we of course, like the tech and Maker is incredibly important too, right? But we really saw that we needed to succeed on like a lot of different fronts, right, for us to get the success that we believe in, to democratize the access to finance for everyone in the world.
What does BizDev look like in a decentralized world? Because if you're doing BizDev for a traditional company, you go to the head of another company or your counterpart in another company, and you try to convince them to come work with you. What does BizDev look like when it's all decentralized? When it's kind of it's a free game there.
Yeah, I would say that of course there's like a lot of the decentralized protocols now, they just adopt DAI as like a default, right? So I would say that like for us, we also with the foundation so the MakerDAO protocol itself is decentralized, right? We don't have any like special rights or anything over that, but like the foundation itself is a normal, not normal, but like we're a company, right? So we have like a more traditional company structure. So of course, for us, we try to get in touch with as many projects as possible. We talk with as many people as possible. And also a lot of the access points into DeFi will be centralized front ends, right? Or centralized access points, centralized applications. So in that sense, we work a lot with, like the centralized companies in the space. We don't only work with decentralized companies or decentralized protocols. We work with literally anyone and everyone we can get our hands on, right? Because that's the way you really create this, like snowballing effect for us, which we have seen, work very well for us lately, is that, if you're already going to be on like most of the protocols, and every single time something new launches, they will just add you by default. So, right now that's really, we have just, tried to put ourselves out there as much as possible. And that's, really, it's been a very interesting journey. And of course, like, we work with everyone from, small one-man companies that sit somewhere in an apartment and just like sits and codes something that DAI can be used with, to all the way up to like publicly listed companies, right?
Well, speaking of partnerships, where has A16Z been the most helpful for you guys to the foundation?
Of course, like having like a name behind us with such a brand recognition, has definitely helped us in a lot of our conversations. And I also know like my American counterparties, so the business teams that we have in the US, they have also been working on the fund with a few different projects. But of course, like getting like the recognition of like such a big, traditional and very, very influential venture capitalist firm behind you is definitely makes some conversations a lot easier.
Mm-hmm. Now, if we look right now, like we said, DeFi, it's a growing snowball. Things are looking great. But what was the most important lesson that DeFi as a whole and that Maker specifically learned on DeFi Black Thursday?
I think that, like what we saw a lot about the discussions afterwards was that, and like kind of like the sentiment was that, having, highly correlated assets as like the only collateral type is something that, can create a very strong liquidity crunch where you don't really have any, asset as the counterparty to pull you out of it, right? So that was kind of like what happened on Black Thursday. So that was also like the community voted in USDC, which, it did quite hastily. And that was, one of the things that sparked a lot of discussion, as I also mentioned earlier. But I think definitely like one of the big takeaways from it was that like we needed to move fast as a community. We needed to get all of this work done sooner rather than later, because we needed to bootstrap the protocol by having, more liquidity, more DAI, more assets in there, more opportunity to actually have, assets that could go in and act as the counterparty if a major collateral type is looking to fail. I also think it showed that there was a great community behind the project, and the auctions, the MKR auctions to go in and repay for the bad debt in the system definitely also went pretty well, right? And then I think in general like diversification through adding new collateral types I think was one of the biggest takeaways.
Mm-hmm. Now, and I think it also showed that this DeFi is here to stay. Maker's here to stay. I mean, it took a big shot and it came back stronger than ever.
I'm not gonna tell you it was a fun day for me though.
I'm sure it wasn't. I'm sure it was not. But you mentioned a little bit before, about people in Argentina not necessarily being into crypto, but utilizing DeFi to kind of keep their money out of local currencies. And moving along that same vein, what local markets has the team at Maker seen the most demand from? And has it been more focused towards, Argentina, even Hong Kong, Lebanon, places that are experiencing political instability right now? Is that where DeFi will really bring its value? Or places where traditional markets are strong and that's where the money is, like New York, London? Where have you seen Maker and DeFi been the strongest?
Yeah, I mean, so actually, like prior to joining Maker, I used to live in Argentina myself. So I lived there for a year and a half and worked out there. And that was also how I got into the crypto scene really and started taking it very seriously, right? And joined Maker remotely from Argentina before I moved back to Denmark. So for me personally, my personal ambition and like personal goal of working in this space is really, to help push these unbiased financial protocols, right? Decentralized finance is something that, we have really removed the bias that we see in traditional finance. Traditional finance is very biased against, current location, race, origin, religion, culture, like all of these things here are things that, play a major role in how you're able to get finance from the traditional system, right? When decentralized finance, all of this doesn't matter, right? It's completely unbiased. It doesn't matter who you are, where you're from, or where you're currently based. The only thing that matters is like which assets are you coming with. These assets recognized by the protocol, and if they are, then you can get terms exactly the same as anyone else who would come and interact with these assets. These protocols would get, right. So if you kind of like take that as like the ambition, right? That is like the goal, getting this out to like as many people as possible. With that being said, I still think we see most of the activity coming from developed markets, like the US, some key markets in Europe, and of course East Asia, where you have like the big crypto triangle of like China, South Korea, and Japan, right? But like if you take emerging economies, I mean, we have seen a lot of activity, especially in places like Argentina, right? And this is something that we really hope to see increase over time. But I mean, of course, right now there's some issues as well. For example, like Ethereum has gotten very expensive to use, right? So for example, we had a platform in Argentina where there was around 50 to 60,000 weekly active users. These people, they were trading, average amount of 5 to 10 DAI per transactions between them. And, right now, like an Ethereum transaction, can easily come up and cost between $1 and $3 for just like a normal transfer. So of course, this is something that, hurts those use cases quite a bit, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, definitely, Ethereum has become very congested and very expensive. Is Ethereum the best blockchain? Is it still the best blockchain for DeFi?
I mean, so I think that depends on what you mean with best, right? So I think like a lot of people, they have kind of like, what can you say? I mean, I think in general, the reason why Ethereum is superior still, without any doubts, right, is that, it is not because of the transactions per second, or it necessarily being, having scaled more, but like decentralized finance is super dependent on user activity and assets, right? And right now, the majority of crypto assets are still on Ethereum, like the majority of users are still on Ethereum. So like, let's say that, Maker would launch on another mainnet, another layer 1 blockchain, right? That, potentially could have like a stronger output. We might be able to issue it there, but if there's no collateral, right? I mean, if there's no assets to come in, like Makers, like the amount of assets we have in Maker right now is around $1.5 billion, right? I mean, a lot of layer ones don't even have that in their market cap, right? So like it would be very difficult for us to hit even closely to the same scale. And then all applications are being built on Ethereum, right? Like that's where by far the most developer activity is. So I do agree that there is some problems with the scalability of Ethereum currently. But without any activity happening on any of the other chains, like Ethereum is just like light years ahead in regards to applications and infrastructure and users.
But this all built so fast. Like you mentioned, there's 1.5 billion right now locked up, but you didn't start at that. You started at zero. And so if Ethereum really doesn't figure it out, if they don't launch a 2.0, if they don't figure out scalability and DeFi, because like you mentioned, so much of DeFi relies upon Maker and DAI. If DeFi is being capped because Ethereum can't scale, and hey, you know what? We might take a big hit, but we got to start. We got to start again. We got to choose one of the Ethereum killers, quote unquote, to build MakerDAO on again, so that it doesn't have this ceiling of scalability on Ethereum. Hypothetically, not that you have to, but hypothetically, which would you choose and why?
I wouldn't choose to migrate the protocol to any other blockchain. Like what we also have been looking into is, like how do we then bridge DAI in a meaningful way to another blockchain, right? So, we just issued DAI on Clayton, which is Kakao, the biggest tech companies, it's the biggest tech company in Korea. It's a tech conglomerate, right? So they have a mainnet called Clayton. And we just bridged DAI to Clayton because, they needed a stable coin. It's frankly much easier for them to, bridge DAI over rather than having to manage a centralized stable coin. So, like in that way, you could imagine that like, even if ETH 2.0 never comes out, right? We could run the main protocol and like all these DeFi protocols and dApps, on Ethereum, where, like if it's a big financial transaction, where you're making profits, you might be okay with paying like the high gas prices, right? That's fine for you. And then we could just bridge DAI to these other mainnets or side chains, or for example, something that I also is a big fan of is stuff like, like Loopring Pay, Raiden, Scale, these kind of like side chain and like, layer 2 scaling solutions, who can, for example, bundle the transactions off chain, like Loopring or something like that. Getting DAI onto them and getting applications onboarded into them, I think would be a much easier task and, much more meaningful and impactful way of doing it rather than trying to migrate, Maker to somewhere else. I'm not saying that it couldn't happen, but like right now, like what for example, like what I'm looking at is like, okay, so we have an application that does mostly peer-to-peer transactions, average transactions $5 to $10. How do we bring the cost of those down without, leaving Ethereum mainnet? And they're like a layer 2 scaling solution might be like the way to go.
Mm-hmm. Well, that brings up the question: what is exactly on chain when it comes to the MakerDAO system? What is it? Is it every transaction? What exactly is on the Ethereum mainnet and happening when someone is interacting with DAI?
Like everything happens on chain, right? So, like the assets are stored on chain in smart contracts, like all the transactions are on chain, like everything happens on chain, right? We don't have anything off chain. The only off chain stuff that comes into Maker is price feeds, right? So I think like what I was referring to, for example, is that like, let's say that, like we need everything on chain, right? And we need everything on Ethereum here. Like the main protocol would be difficult to have, on Loopring, for example. But, for example, Near protocol, is a pretty hyped, Ethereum killer that launches with proof of stake and sharding, if I'm not mistaken. And there, for example, they're launching it with DAI. They're bridging DAI over to Near because they want a stablecoin there, right? And in that sense, you can then see that, actually from the get-go, you would be able to, have, all of their dApps and apps running using DAI, and the DAI would still come from the Ethereum mainnet. But like on Near, it would be much cheaper to transact DAI than it would be on Ethereum, right? So then all of a sudden we have like the scalability on the DAI side, which is very desirable, because like on the transaction, like on the Maker protocol side, like if you're opening, let's say like a big vault, like a $5 million vault, you're okay with paying like $200 in gas, right? Like, it doesn't really matter. But like if you're sitting and opening like smaller vaults or doing transactions, you don't want to pay those high gas costs. So that's like a way of like bringing scalability like on another mainnet, because they choose to adopt DAI because DAI is the strongest stablecoin asset, right?
Mm-hmm. So in your view, what's the biggest barrier towards adoption for DeFi right now?
I mean, I think it's just still too young, you know. I mean, a lot of stuff is happening. There's been a lot of progress, right? But I still think that, you know, the industry is incredibly young. Yeah, so I think that's just like, you know, we need to, you know, withstand the test of time. And, you know, like, you know, MCD, you know, launched last year. MCD hasn't even been out for a full year yet, right? A lot of these other protocols haven't really been out for like very long neither, right? So I still think that, you know, we are still like in the innovation phase, and that's also why we see kind of like a lot of the crazy stuff that's been going on over the summer. It's because people are innovating like crazy. I think eventually things will settle down a little bit. But like it's attracting a lot of attention to the space, right? And a lot of users, which is also why we see Ethereum is super clocked, right? Because now there's just so many transactions you can make where it makes you money. You know, I think we're still like very young.
Mm-hmm. Now, you know, one of the big things for DeFi is that, you know, even for traditional finance, you know, there's a big barrier for entry because not everyone has access to the banking system. Not everyone has access to traditional financial instruments, but anyone with an internet connection can access a DeFi platform. But is that really true? I mean, it still requires, these are extremely complex, you know, technologies and concepts and banking instruments to understand in DeFi, you know, especially now with all this innovation that you're speaking about. It's really crazy how complex some of these things with the arbitrage and you know, yield farming gets. You know, is it ready? Is it yet at the point where, hey, I can go, you know, to my father, you know, who understands the traditional system? Can the average person who's not into crypto but has capital, wants to invest, is it there yet, DeFi, where someone new can just show up and utilize these instruments?
Yeah. So I mean, I think it also depends on like what is the goal, right? I mean, so of course I agree with you. Like if you want to go in and interact with the smart contracts themselves, or you want to go in and, you know, interact with like the bare bone of the systems, right? I mean, that might be quite complicated for you. I mean, of course there are like some front ends you can use, right? But I personally, I believe a lot in kind of like these like centralized user aggregation layers. So, you know, we've already seen some of them focus on the DeFi user. So for example, like Serion, InstaDApp, DeFi Saver and stuff like that, which is like focused on, you know, giving like the already DeFi user a very good experience. But I really, you know, I'm a believer in like, you know, the trusted front ends. So, you know, you can imagine if like a major fintech or like a traditional corporation, they would launch a front end where they would basically manage your interaction with the DeFi protocols, but they would give you all the benefits of DeFi. That is like where I personally view as like a big opportunity for like a traditional company to go in and, you know, attract a lot of users, right? Because for example, if you take like neobanks, right? So there's been like a lot of neobanks, you know, popping out all over the world, like N26, Monzo, Revolut, and they have managed to attract millions of users, right? But like none of them can provide an interest rate because they don't have a banking license. So, you know, like some of them, you know, allows you to invest into stocks, or, you know, invest into, you know, Revolut even has like they invest into crypto, right? And they have abilities for you to, you know, hold, you know, a lot of different fiat currencies in this application, right? You could imagine like if they want to, you know, create like a personalized savings product, they could actually do that very easily with DeFi and the infrastructure they already have in their system, right? So that would potentially be a way of, you know, DeFi accessing, you know, their users, while at the same time they could go in and provide tremendous amount of value to their own users, right? Because now all of a sudden people can actually, you know, earn an interest rate by having money with them. And like, but a lot of these things here, of course, depending on like a lot of things going in the right way and like things settling a little bit, being a little bit mature and so on. But I think this is like where we would see, you know, eventually. So okay, so the way that I often see these things here is that you really have like three different main groups within like the space that we kind of like operate on the trenches of, right? You have finance, you have fintech, and you have crypto. And I believe that over time, these three groups will move much closer. And eventually, you know, you wouldn't even differentiate between like fintech and crypto and like personal finance, right? Because you would just have a fintech application that, you know, gives you all the fintech services and benefit that you're familiar with. This would interact with, you know, crypto, where, you know, DeFi would be part of it. And, you know, all of these things, because like everyone just want to be able to provide the best service to their customers as possible, right? So I really think, I think it just takes like one of the neobanks, or for example, one of the crypto neobanks, which we also have a lot of, to start, toying around with these services to gain a competitive advantage over the others, and thereby, eventually onboarding all of them into, offering the same services. So that's kind of like where I see. I don't necessarily see, like my parents or your parents coming in and interacting, with the Maker protocol itself directly, but they might, use, some fintech companies' application that they already are familiar with, who then added the DAI savings rate or added like compound savings or something. Yeah.
Isn't there a danger once these kind of centralized front ends come into the picture, and start for convenience sake helping people manage their DeFi products? Won't we end up seeing what eventually will become again a mirror of the traditional systems, where these centralized powers, we essentially go to them for convenience, they help manage, but they end up then holding all the governance. They end up holding all this power, and eventually together centralizing the power, of these supposedly decentralized systems.
But this has been like this in the space for years already, right? I mean, where's most of the liquidity and capital? On centralized exchanges. We're already sitting with this problem, right? The big difference here, I think, is that like if it's like these fintech platforms, for example, they're regulated, right? A lot of them have licensing issued by like proper regulators, where like a lot of the crypto exchanges, they operate a little bit more in the wild. So I think, I mean, if that's like something you're scared about, this is also something that has been mentioned a lot inside the Maker community, for example. For example, with something like WBTC, right? I mean, yeah, you have Bitcoin where you have a counterparty, which is like a centralized asset, like a centralized custodian, right? BitGo. But like the big thing here is that like a lot of the Bitcoin we already see is already stored with centralized custodians, right? I mean, most of the crypto liquidity and assets are on centralized exchanges. So we have also seen hostile takeovers in the past, right? Using liquidity from centralized exchanges. So this is a problem we already have. So I'm not sure that would change anything. I think it would be, yeah, it would. I think we would be fine.
Mm-hmm. Well, so you're saying that the next big push in DeFi comes when more mainstream or big fintech companies actually come and offer the everyday mainstream person an easy front end to interact with DeFi.
I'm not saying it will be the next big push, but I think when it happens, and I believe that it eventually will happen, that will definitely be like a very big push.
Mm-hmm. Well, Gustav, as BizDev for Maker, please get on it. I'm sorry for taking your time. Contact all the big fintech companies and get involved. I thank you for taking the time and helping give us a little bit about what's going behind the scenes with DeFi and Maker. And for all our viewers at home watching Reimagine 2020, I'm Yonah Hochhauser. Thanks for watching.